we're here, Miguel Otero and myself, Federico Steinberg. We are the economics team, the international political economy team at the Royal Elcano Institute. And we've been working for quite a long time now on the rise of populist and anti-establishment parties. And we produced recently a paper that we wanted to bring forward and that incorporates reasons for the support to these parties beyond the standard economic decline and xenophobia arguments. But let's start with these two. Miguel, how would you explain the rise of these anti-establishment parties by these first two factors?
Well, I mean, the first is inequality. We've seen that we have, through the work of Piketty and as well of Milanovic, we have, I think consistent evidence suggesting that there's income and wealth inequality in the world. Especially, I mean, if you look at Milanovic's work, you have the middle classes of the West being the losers of the globalization in the last 25 years. We see that, there has been a lot of outsourcing of manufacturing. The emerging markets have increased their living standards. So the middle classes of the emerging markets, and in particular China, Asia, they have been the winners. They have income growths of 20, 30, 40, even 50%, while wages in the West have been stagnant since the 1970s, and therefore there's a feeling among a lot of these people, working class, middle class people in the West, in Europe, in the United States, that globalization has been great for the emerging middle classes and for the so-called plutocrats, or the 1% or even the 1% of the 1%. And therefore, the feeling is that they want to change the framework, and they vote for parties that are anti-establishment, anti-system, anti-globalization, and in many ways, that explains part of Brexit, where people are just, unhappy, angry, and they want just to punish the elites. And as well, Trump now, the win of Trump and the rise of the National Front in France. So I think that's a thesis that is now consolidated, and there are a lot of media talk about it, and I think explains quite a lot of what's happening.
Exactly, but there's something very interesting that we've identified, that is that in countries with very low unemployment levels, like the Netherlands, Germany, Denmark, or even the United States, in which you cannot easily argue that globalization has really destroyed massively employment and has made a large majority of population losers, where you get support for these parties. And here we introduce a more sociological explanation, which has to do with identity, the rise of the fear of immigration. Could we develop a little bit more this idea?
Sure. I mean, I think there is a massive change culturally speaking. Globalization has brought a lot of migration to all these countries. We see now countries that they have around 10, 12, 15% of immigrants, second generation, third generation, even more. And so we are seeing a transformation of our communities. I mean, in Spain it's not so much the case, because a lot of migrants are still first generation, but in places like from Finland to Austria, you have that. And I think a lot of the white native working class, not only working class, but as well kind of middle class, or even the rich people, they feel that their identity, their community is in jeopardy. It's menaced, it's threatened by this diluting of the identity of Britain, the identity of France, etc. And this creates a lot of resistance. And if you combine that with the refugee crisis and recent attacks, terrorist attacks in France, you can see that you have a cocktail there that in certain countries means that a lot of more xenophobic, racist parties get more support. But then I think you should tell our audience more why Spain does not have perhaps this type of right-wing xenophobic parties.
Exactly. Spain seems a perfect candidate, in fact, because we have high unemployment. It's going down, but it's still around 20%. Very deep economic crisis, and then inequality rising. So all the factors, and surprisingly, or not so much, as we'll see, it doesn't have an extreme right populist party. There are many reasons for that, but just to talk about them briefly, we have on the one hand the fact that the Franco dictatorship in Spain ended in 1975. So in a way, it's not really well accepted by civil society and the population in general to say that authoritarian regimes or xenophobic attitudes or this kind of leadership is something that is welcome. But that may change over time, because in a way we have a lag compared to other European countries with this. But then the majority of the migration to Spain has been coming from Latin America. This means Spanish-speaking Catholic migrants that tend to integrate more easily within the Spanish society, or at least generate less resentment than the kind of immigration you have in Northern Europe. Additionally, this is the fact that Spain doesn't have a really strong national identity, or at least if it has an identity, it accepts diversity, because Spain has 4 official languages, and people are more or less comfortable by feeling, Catalan and Spanish and European, or Galician and Spanish and European and cosmopolitan in a way. This is not the case, as you mentioned, for countries like France, where national identity is more strong, and probably where people have more of an issue by feeling French and European at the same time. And then another factor is that there was a very important emigration from Spain to Europe in the 60s and 70s, and still lots of people have members of their family in the previous generation that have emigrated and maybe came back or didn't come back. So this idea of going and coming back is there's less resistance to it, but nothing impedes in the long term the creation of a party like this in Spain. But for the time being, we don't have it. But moving to another explanation, because I think that what we try to do in this paper is also to look a little bit more into less discussed explanation. There's this issue with technological change and new jobs, new professions, and how to tackle that. And we also think this has a lot of importance and interacts with the other explanations. What's your take on that?
Definitely. I think, technology, although we had the computer, internet a few decades back, but I think social processes, and we see it as well. We had the financial crisis in 2008, so the social outcomes of a lot of the structural events, take a long time to come to the fore, and I think technology, especially with smartphones, with robotization, with some kind of smart technologies generally, we find that a lot of people feel threatened because of that, in the sense that they think that their jobs have been taken away, which has happened in many industries where robots do the jobs of people, especially low-skilled workers. But we see now that it's not only the low-skilled workers or migrants that are threatened by that, but middle class people, accountants, clerks, even lawyers. That they feel that more and more they are paid less, or they might not do the job for very long. And I think this creates a lot of fear, a lot of threatening, creates as well some sort of loss of control. The good old days are gone. My children, they might be very educated and have master's degrees, but they will not be able to do the jobs that I've done, for example, as a middle class. And then you have this huge gap happening right now, right? You have the gap between the older generations that struggle more with the new technologies and feel more afraid and at unease with it, and then you have as well the gap between the people in the rural areas and the urban areas. And I think that explains as well support for Brexit. All the people generally voting for getting out and for a Britain that is outside the European Union, because I think there's quite a lot of romanticism about Britain before the European Union, a very strong kind of global country. And in the United States, I mean, you can see as well that a lot of people from the rural areas tended to vote for Trump, and I think there's kind of some sort of reaction of feeling that you are left behind by the establishment, and perhaps your children don't have the skills to actually ride on the globalization wave, so you're unhappy and angry and you vote for this party.
Exactly. So basically we have a dangerous cocktail, because at home robots are taking your jobs, and abroad the emerging China is taking your jobs, and then you don't have the welfare state to protect you, right? This is another one of the arguments we've identified. People perceived that the welfare state, a generous welfare state capable of protecting individuals from any kind of adversity, was going to be here forever and with growing capacity to help individuals. And what we've seen in the last years is perhaps just the opposite, right? So the perception that some elements of the welfare state cannot be sustained, and this has to do with demographics, but it has to do also with international competition, etc. So this is also creating changes. What kind of changes?
Well, I mean, as you know, I mean, this comes from my rereading of Robert Gilpin, and the idea here is that once you have very developed welfare states, and I mean, generally, if you look at GDP levels, I mean, expenditure has increased in almost every OECD country. You have interest groups that are strongly protectionist because they feel threatened again by globalization. They feel threatened by, if you are pensioners, you think, okay, now, the newcomers, they have to compete with China, they will earn less, so therefore they might not be able to pay as much for me to one day have my pension. You might think of, all these people in the public services, because we are seeing that with the new free trade agreements that are not really about free trade, they are more about regulation, standards, and public procurement, investment, etc., that they feel, that the competition that usually was in the secondary sector, in the industrial manufacturing sector, and that's where, the pressure on wages was, that is now slowly creeping into the services and public services sector. So, you can see why a lot of people are resisting this, and why you have the unions from the public sector, being against TTIP, being against CETA, the agreement between the European Union and Canada, and TISA, etc. So I think, you have, strong groups of people that are unhappy about reducing the welfare state because they feel more threatened. And on the other hand, I think you have as well a lot of people that are not in the public sector, that are less protected, and they feel that it's a bit unfair. And so I think there's an element of as well of contestation to the establishment, to the bureaucracy, this word that is used so much, of the people that really, do very little but earn so much. And I think, again, those discourses of, dismantling some of that and getting rid of bureaucracy, like in Britain, a very strong appeal, explains why some people would vote for this anti-establishment parties.
But that brings us precisely to our last hypothesis here, right? This idea of, the role of angry people revolting against elites, right? What we label in our paper the crisis of, the democratic representation or democracy as we know it, liberal democracy, in which we've seen many people just angry, just willing to say that enough is enough. I'm going to vote for this candidate that maybe he's lying to me, but he's promising to me something else, because the standard candidates, the Hillary Clinton, the ones that are using fear to tell me I should not change anything because we're doing as best as we can, and this will take time, but let's try it. These are the people that have been, for decades ruling the country, either social democrats or Christian Democrats, either, the traditional Republican Party or the Democrats in the US. And all of a sudden, there's this more and more people willing to try something else because of this, angriness to the establishment, right?
Yeah, totally. I think there are several elements there. I think, the financial crisis and the bailing out of the banking system created a lot of, anger. That, people feel the ones on the top, they were not really punished, or they didn't really pay the price. The adjustment fell on the population, and that created distance between the elites and the people. And I think there's other elements there as well. I mean, one, I think, is the role of experts and a lot of the media, the traditional media, that a lot of them are educated in liberal campuses, and there's a lot of research now done a bit on that. Their framework of values of cosmopolitanism, liberal democracy, being in favor of diversity, not being racist, xenophobic, misogynist, and homophobous. That this kind of discourse that is very much ingrained in the elites, a lot of people might not feel that way, and they are, I think, angry as well, or fed up of having always this constraint of what is politically correct, right? And I think Trump's campaign on we are politically incorrect, reverberates a lot between all these people that feel kind of that they were not represented, that these elites did not represent them, and so therefore I think there's an element there of voting for these parties. And finally, I think we have to understand that in many ways politics has delegated on technocrats. With the central banks' independence, with the IMF, the World Trade Organization, all the OECD, all these kind of technocratic expert institutions that tell governments what should be done, and governments kind of rely on them. I think the best case is central banks on fixing the economy. Has left politics out of the public debate. So technocrats have to solve problems, but technocrats don't really have political mandates. So when you have a vacuum there, it's very easy to be filled by more populist voices. And so populism, where there was no politics, now there's populism. And I think that explains as well why people, they feel it doesn't matter who I vote, they will do the same. They will do what the technocrats tell them, the experts tell them. So I'm going to go for someone that tells me something radically different.
Mm-hmm. So one of our conclusions, so to speak, is that on the one hand, we have to take this fear and anxiety seriously. I think that we've been for some time trying to say this is really a minor thing, this will just go away. I think it's important to realize that there's not a problem of communication, right? Sometimes it's argued that globalization is great, technological change is great, and whoever doesn't understand that should study the numbers, right? They're big losers from globalization, they're big losers from technological change, especially in the short run. And therefore, something has to be done about it, right? First, listen to concerns, but in a way, what can we say about possible solutions for this?
Well, as you know, we haven't really developed this very, very consistently yet. But I guess we agree there that something has to be done on redistribution. There's a lot of generation of wealth in this system. But it is concentrated. It's concentrated in a few hands, and this is now acknowledged by everyone that actually a massive inequality creates instability. It's bad for growth, and I think there more needs to be done in terms of perhaps tackling tax haven, perhaps as well making sure that companies pay their fair amount to societies. So I think that on that front, on the kind of xenophobia, multiculturalism type of discussion, better integrating the migrants, don't create ghettos, giving them the chances to actually progress. Of course, when they progress, usually there's resistance by the natives, by the incumbents, and so maybe do it gradually. explaining that diversity is good for a country. Historically, the more diverse countries have done better. The United States, for example, I think is one of the best examples of a country that has welcomed a lot of people from all around the world, and this brings different type of thinking, innovation, contestation as well, and creativity. And I think that should be explained much better in that regard. And perhaps you can talk about
yes. There are other things. I mean, of course, but this is basically something everybody talks about. That education has to be improved, promoted, rethought. The education for the 21st century at the level of the school for children, for also ongoing education of the workforce, special education for unemployed and displaced workers. This is key to give them tools to reinvent themselves if their jobs have been taken over either by Chinese competition or technological change. So the welfare state has to be also rethought to be able to, not to protect specific jobs that are gone probably and will not come back, but basically give the people the tools to empower them and not, just protect the old style. And then different elements of the welfare state have to be rethought to make them sustainable. I think that all in all, we kind of agree that, if we can still live in liberal democracies with market economies and with a welfare state, new ideas, new parties that bring new solutions or contestation are a good thing, are going to bring to more sustainable equilibria in the long run. But these are probably the red lines that we have to look for and be careful about. The welfare state transformed by the welfare state, liberal democracy, and market economy. And then there's a recurring question that we're getting, which is, are we back in the 1930s? Should we worry so much or not?
I mean, as you know, I mean, my feeling is that, some of the rhetoric is there. I think some of going back to more like, xenophobic discourses and inequality creating tensions is there. But I think the framework is still much better. I mean, the institutional framework, the democracies were there, still not as developed as they are now. The welfare states were, non-existent practically in a lot of these countries. So now, in many ways, those that actually are angry and are kind of happy to go for very radical options are those that usually are protected as well. They live in a welfare state. They might be pensioners as well. They have much less in a way to lose because they feel the basic things that you just said, those are not questioned. I think as well the participation of women in the workforce, in voting. In the 1930s, there was certainly not as much participation of women, and I think if we look at the votes, it's usually men, not only, but majority men, angry men, white men, etc. That doesn't matter whether low skilled or very rich, that vote for these options, and so I think that it's a cushion to. And in Europe, we didn't really have the European Union, and despite all the critiques and the fear that this might all come down and fall apart, this creates certain constraints, and Poland cannot do what they perhaps wanted to do, or Hungary or other countries that might change government to a more radical option. They are more constrained than they used to be.
Exactly. Well, on that optimistic note, we'll leave it and we'll continue exploring these issues.
Great.